Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Saturday, June the 11th, and welcome to Stories That Inspire Us with Janice. Today, I have on an amazing guest, and first, I want to welcome her, Stephanie Duesing. Welcome to the Stories podcast.
Thank you, Janice, for having me here. I'm so honored to be a guest on your show and so delighted to have a chance to come and talk with you and with your listeners about CVI or cerebral/cortical visual impairment. Thanks so much for having me today.
Oh, you're so welcome. Stephanie, you are the author of Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. And this all stems from, as you mentioned, the disease CVI, which no parent should ever go through. And your son, Sebastian, unfortunately has CVI. Can you explain a little bit more, like take us back to that moment when you and your husband, when you and your family found out that this was going on with your son?
Thank you. Sure, I'd be happy to. So first, a little background. So cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI, was identified as the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world more than 10 years ago, and it doesn't have a diagnostic code. And there are tens of thousands of people here in the US who have CVI. And back in 2017, when we discovered that my son had it, there was only a handful of doctors in the entire world who had any modern scientific understanding of what it is and how to diagnose it. And so to answer your question, to take you back to that moment, CVI can be an entirely invisible disability. It is a brain-based form of visual impairment, blindness, and it's entirely separate from ocular blindness. And so ocular blindness is where the eye and the optic nerve are damaged. And that's what I think most typically sighted people think of when they think of being blind. They imagine that everything is dark. And that actually is not actually true either. But that is the stereotypical idea of what most typically sighted people think about when they think about blindness. And CVI is different. CVI is a brain-based vision impairment or blindness. And again, it can be entirely invisible disability. And so my son, Sebastian, back in 2017, was a straight A honor student. He's a very gifted artist who draws and paints with photographic realism when he wants to. He was on the water-polo and the diving team at his high school, and we had literally no idea that he had any disability of any kind whatsoever. And we happened to be going through old photos, and we discovered that my son could not recognize himself or anybody else in any of the pictures. And in 2017, I had never heard of CVI. I had never heard of face blindness or prosopagnosia. I didn't know that it was possible for a human being to be face blind. And so here I was sitting next to my son who draws and paints faces with photographic realism when he wants to, and he's not recognizing his own face in the pictures we were looking at or anyone else. And that was like the hair on my arms just stood up just now, just still talking about it. It was very strange to me at that time. Like, how could this be possible? How could you not know who you are? We were looking at old baby pictures. And so I'll be honest, I was that mom who spent like $1,500 on scrapbooking supplies when my son was a baby, and I made him a baby book and I didn't do anything else. I didn't touch it again, ever. And so we literally had not been through these pictures ever since he was quite small. And I was narrating to him about who was in the pictures and, like, oh, these are your cousins from Canada that you haven't seen for like 7 years. And, things he wouldn't remember. Here's your neighbors from the town we used to live in when you were a baby that he wouldn't remember. And then all of a sudden, the cutest picture of him popped up on the screen. And I mean, we've been doing this for half an hour now. So now he was no longer a baby, he was a toddler. But we've been looking at pictures of him for half an hour. And this adorable picture shows up on my screen. And I was like, oh, look, who's that? And there was just crickets. And finally, he just said, well, how would I know? And that was just the strangest thing. I mean, I'd never heard of prosopagnosia. Like I said, I didn't know it was possible for a human being to be face blind. I didn't know about any of it. And so I immediately that night went to work researching, like, what's wrong with my son? And I was Googling, facial recognition. And I was getting all these like sort of facial recognition software kind of answers, but not getting any real answers about why a human wouldn't be able to recognize a face. It took some time because there was really very little information back then. But eventually I found it and I was like, oh, prosopagnosia, facial recognition, the inability to recognize faces. It's an actual thing. And there wasn't a whole lot of information about it. In fact, there was very little that I could find, but I knew it was real. I knew it was an actual thing. And the very next day, we discovered that my son had taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns as a toddler and had been navigating our own home that way his entire life without anybody knowing. And that was devastating because he'd been navigating. We have a very small neighborhood. He'd been navigating our neighborhood to his friends' houses that way. And he went to an extremely architecturally complex school that literally had been designed as an open concept school in the 1970s and then added on to twice by, I think, a lunatic. I mean, it was one of those buildings where you can't get from the third floor on one side of the building to the third floor on the other side without going down and then back up. And he was navigating that building by counting his steps and turns and we had no idea, absolutely no idea. And that's when it became really frightening because, we were always considered ourselves just to be the parents of a gifted student. My son is incredibly gifted. He was identified as gifted in kindergarten, although our actual gifted program in our school district doesn't begin until second grade. He was so above that the teacher actually had to create a pull-out program just for him in kindergarten. And then when he was in third grade, he actually finished the fourth grade math book first quarter of third grade without any assistance whatsoever. We didn't even know he had done it. I'm not into homework. I actually don't believe in homework. So there was no coaching on our part. He just did it. And the teacher said, we have to skip him a grade because we cannot meet his needs academically in the grade level that he's at. And we actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons. We did not want to separate my son from his friends. He had a great cohort of friends in the grade level he was in. And honestly, we didn't really know any of the other kids in the grade level above. He didn't know any of the other kids in the grade level above. So it was not something we sought. So to make a long story short, we worked with the school district and we talked about what our other options were. And grade promotion turned out to be the least bad of the three options that we were given. And so we ended up doing the grade promotion with my son. And if you know anything at all about grade promotion in public schools, they look at absolutely every aspect of your child emotionally, socially, academically, and physically, everything. And my son went through the entire grade promotion process and was scrutinized. And he was rated as very athletic by his PE teacher. I was always kind of a C student in PE. Haha, right? No surprise. Here's my son getting an A in PE every quarter and he's blind, right? We didn't know. Anyway, so long story short, as a third grader, he went through the entire grade promotion process without raising any alarms whatsoever. We never once ever had any doctor, teacher, friend, family member, anyone ever suggest to us that there was anything wrong with my son's health, behavior, or appearance. We had absolutely no idea. So it was terrifying to discover overnight. Now my son, we know he's not recognizing faces and he's also not recognizing places. And in my research that night, when I was trying to figure out the whole face blindness thing, I realized I learned that night that face blindness and also what's called topographic agnosia, prosopagnosia and topographic agnosia, they are often happen at the same time to people, and people who have one often have the other. And we know that now because facial recognition takes place in the right fusiform gyrus of the brain, which is here, kind of above and behind your right ear. And if you have brain damage to that area of your brain, then you're likely to not be able to recognize faces. And the ability to recognize places is processed right by there. So if you have damage to one, it's often likely to have damage in the other as well. And so that's why it goes together. And so we were terrified. I was terrified because now, my son was planning to go off to college. And I was like, you are not safe out in the world without some kind of, you need a better way to navigate than just by counting steps and turns in a familiar area, right? You can't just go off into the world doing this. You're going to need to have some form of formal training and navigation, like orientation and mobility training is what we do with blind people. It's called O&M, orientation and mobility training. And some people who are blind use white canes and some people don't. It just depends on what their vision impairment is like. But anyway, long story short, I knew we needed to get a diagnosis in order for my son to get those services. And so I immediately made a doctor's appointment with the neuropsychologist. Sorry, we saw so many doctors. I made an appointment with my son's neuropsychologist who had just recently done a full neuropsych evaluation on my son for a completely unrelated concussion that he'd had just a few months before. And so I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from that very first appointment. And that doctor looked at me like I was crazy and said, I can't help you, and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that.
Oh my gosh. Now I want to stop you, and I do apologize
No,
because
it's okay.
I have so many questions that are coming to mind. So I want to go back to that day when you realize that something is not right with my son.
Mhm.
Obviously, that set off a lot of alarms for you. And excuse me, you go, like you said, you went that night and did a lot of research and Googled. I can't even fathom going through something like that and then knowing that you were on the right, and thank God you were on the right track. Like from day one, when you realized what was happening, that in and of itself must have obviously thrown you and your family through the ringer. I just can't even imagine that. And then all these different terminologies coming up, and the face blindness, the O&M training, knowing that your son going off to college possibly would not be safe because he needed to make sure that he had those services available to him.
Mhm.
My question is, that moment when you knew in your heart, because moms know,
We do.
when you knew that something was so serious with your son, personally for you, what was that like? Like, we're mama bears, right? What was that like for you?
Oh, it was unreal. And even talking about it now, and what's 4 years later, I can't remember, 5 years later, I mean, the hair on my arm stands up. So what happened was the next day, the way we figured out that my son was also not recognizing environments was because we had been talking about him. He was just about ready to enroll in driver's ed. I almost put my blind son in driver's ed because, I mean, it's a totally invisible disability and we didn't know he had CVI. And so we were talking about driver's ed, and my son was asking me that night, oh, well, in driver's ed, are they going to teach me like where things are, like where the streets are and stuff? And I said, well, maybe, but not really. That's just something you just figure out where those things are, right? As you do it, you figure out where all the streets are and how they're, where they are in relationship to each other. And we happened to be going to a thing at a church nearby that night. And so on the way to the church, I was just, because I didn't know he had CVI, I was just quizzing him about the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, and the street names as we drove from our house to this church. And so I was like, okay, right now we are headed north and we're on Main Street or whatever, and then when we turn right, what direction are we going to be going? And my son, both going to the church and coming home, when I quizzed him in reverse on the way back, got every answer right. He got every answer correct. He is really bright and really smart, and he got every answer correct. And then when we walked into the kitchen, the stress of it all, he just had a meltdown on my kitchen floor and he was crying. And I was like, what is wrong with my son? What is wrong? Why are you so upset? I had never seen him like this in my life. And he said, the street names, they don't make any sense to me. I don't know where they are.
That must have been so
terrifying.
alarming.
Oh my gosh, it was terrifying. He said, I don't know where, the street that's right by our house, the main street by our house that we drive on every day. He didn't know where that was. And I'm like, how is that possible? I was asking him that. How could you not know where that is? And he just said, I don't know. And he grabbed a piece of paper because I couldn't understand what was wrong. I'd never heard of CVI. I didn't know it was possible for a human being to look typically sighted and yet be blind, right? I had no idea. And he grabbed a notebook and he wrote the names of all the streets that I'd just been quizzing him on one side. And he put names over there. And then he put on the other side, it was like streets. And then he drew like bubble clouds around each of them. So they were separate from each other. And he was like, and there was like a does not equal sign in the middle. Like he knew the names of the streets and he knew that streets existed, but he didn't know where the actual streets were, where the name, how they attached to each other.
Okay.
Right? He couldn't see
Yeah.
it. He couldn't picture it. And so then I was like, oh my gosh. And because I already knew he wasn't recognizing faces from the night before, then I was like, he's not recognizing his environment. And it was just terrifying. It was just devastating to realize, oh my gosh, this kid's 15 years old and he can't recognize his own environment. And so then, of course, I felt this overwhelming compulsion to show him where he lives. I don't know why. And so I literally pulled an apple out. I had to show him, like, I made a map on our kitchen table, like a tactile map. And I just could only think of Helen Keller and the water. I don't know if you know that story, and how her teacher signed the word water as she ran the water over her hand. And I thought, well, if my son can't see where the street is, can't picture where the street is from where we are, maybe he can feel it. And so I made this map on the kitchen table with apples representing the houses on our streets and yarn for the streets and scarves. And I literally had him touch the map. And when he got to where, as I had him go through the map with his fingers and he got to where that major street is, and the light bulb went off on his face. He's like, oh, now I know where it is. And like, I'm a teacher, right? As a teacher, when kids, that light bulb goes off and they get it for the first time. I've seen that expression so many times, right? Like you can't fake it, right? Like my son, like, oh my God, he just understood where the main street by his house is for the very first time in his life. And it was just, I don't know how to describe it, because it was devastating, but it was also amazing at the same time, because I knew now what my son had accomplished despite being really severely visually impaired. I really felt like this was like a Helen Keller moment. Like, oh my gosh, my son has been masquerading as typically sighted and he's blind. So right? How is he as a straight A honor student and on the water polo team? It was so this very strange, like, how is it possible?
A very surreal moment. And so now you're in that realm. You know that there's something wrong with your son. Like you said, you did the research and then you made the appointment with the physician. Mm-hmm. And the physician said that they couldn't help. What was the next logical step for you?
Oh, well,
for your son.
Right. So we saw optometrists, neurooptometrists, ophthalmologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, neurologists, neuropsychologists, and we traveled across the country looking for anyone who could diagnose my son's CVI and prescribe a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility training for my son. And we were labeled crazy by the medical establishment, and we were repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. And we were not asking for medication. We were not asking for unneeded surgery. My son's brilliant, and he needed a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility training with a white cane. That's all he needed. And we were just treated like the most horrible people in the world because the doctors were not getting any training in this condition. And as I said, the National Institute of Health and the National Eye Institute have recognized just this year for the first time that CVI is indeed the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world. It is more common than ocular blindness, and it is a huge problem. We have tens of thousands of people here in the US who have it, and our experiences struggling to get a diagnosis are actually common. People who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism. They're routinely misdiagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders. They're told that they're intellectually disabled. It's ridiculous. They're told they have everything possible except what they actually have, which is a vision impairment.
So you're in that realm, you're seeing all these specialists. Mm-hmm. What was the point in time when you found You must have found a specialist.
Oh my goodness, yes. So I have to thank Lucas Frank, who is from the Seeing Eye Guide Dog organization. Just a few days after we figured out that Sebastian had something wrong with his vision, I immediately reached out to the Seeing Eye Guide Dog organization because I was just, more than anything, I was terrified of my son being like lost and alone in this world. And I thought maybe a guide dog, at least he wouldn't be alone. You know, I knew nothing about blindness. I knew nothing about guide dogs or how that works, but I was scared. And I mean, we'd already had a couple of bad doctor's appointments under my belt at that point, and I was realizing that there was something really, really wrong and that we weren't getting a lot of support from the medical community. And Lucas Frank was amazing. He was the person who kept coming back and saying, you know, what can I do to help? You know, what can I do to help? And eventually it was through Lucas Frank, he connected me with Jim Daramayak, who is the head of rehabilitation at the Johns Hopkins Eye Clinic. And Jim Daramayak donated an online course on CVI. It was a $150 course. And he donated that to me so that I could learn to be a better advocate for my son. And so I took the course, I got an A. And then the very next day I was messaging him saying, what do I do now? Because we still don't have a diagnosis, right? And he gave me the names of a couple of doctors in the area that might be able to help us. And even with all the correct terminology, taking the course, the support of people in the field, even with that, I couldn't get a diagnosis for my son. And so that at that point, even then, I was like, well, I'm going to just find the person who taught the course. And the person who taught the course was Professor Gordon Dutton, who's in Scotland. And he is an amazing, amazing person. And I reached out to him through the CVI Scotland website. And I was amazed. I sent a message just briefly describing what we saw with Sebastian's vision and the problems we were having getting a diagnosis. And Professor Dutton responded immediately. And through him, with his help, he coordinated a week-long research study on my son Sebastian in Paris. So I actually had to take my son to Paris for a week with Dr. Sylvie Chakran, is the head of the unit of vision and cognition at La Fondation Rothschild. And we were there for a week, and Dr. Chakran did a whole research study on Sebastian. And the thing that was important about that is part of the reason we had difficulty getting a diagnosis for Sebastian was because my son, like many people who have cerebral palsy and CVI, he has a normal appearing MRI. An MRI is a brain scan that just measures, it looks at what your brain looks like. It does not tell you how your brain is behaving, how it's functioning. And so about 10% of people who have cerebral palsy and about 10% of people who have CVI have normal appearing MRI scans, even though they still have the condition, because the MRI only tells you what the structure of the brain is like. It does not tell you whether the brain is working properly. So we had a normal MRI and the doctor's like, well, then he's fine. Well, he wasn't fine, not at all fine. And so we went to Paris and Dr. Chakran performed what's called a SPECT scan on my son's brain. And a SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test that measures blood flow to the brain. And it tells you, they put a little bit of nuclear medicine in your blood and then it lights up the areas in the brain where, you know, where the blood is traveling to. Anywhere in the brain that's not receiving blood flow is dead tissue. And so that is how we discovered that, yes, my son did indeed have some pretty significant brain damage. And we know it's because I almost died giving birth to him. I almost died. I had preeclampsia and I coded from the epidural and my blood pressure crashed to 40/26. And I had a mini stroke when I was giving birth to him. And I didn't know it at the time because my face wasn't sagging, you know, none of that. But we know that's the reason that my son has this, because he had no other, there's nothing else it could be. So anyway, so yeah.
So then now he had the diagnosis.
Well, no. Okay. So there are different standards of care between Europe and the United States. So no, we did not have a diagnosis. What we had was a nice report from a brilliant, one of the best researchers in CVI in the world, which was wonderful. When we brought that home, then finally, once we had actual evidence of his brain damage and a beautiful report from, like I said, a brilliant researcher in the CVI community, then we were finally able to get to the Perkins School for the Blind, and Dr. Barry Cran is the head of optometrics there, and he was absolutely wonderful. He spent so much time collecting history and everything with us. And so he was the one who actually diagnosed my son. But more importantly, we were able to connect with Dr. Lotfi Marabet, who is the director of the Harvard CVI neuroplasticity research study. Because one of the reasons my son's disability was completely invisible is because my son is actually the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally. He sees with words like a bat sees with sound. And Sebastian spent 6 hours in the fMRI at the Harvard CVI neuroplasticity research study. And Dr. Lotfi Marabet actually captured Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI. And he and Dr. Barry Cran published a paper on Sebastian's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the journal Neurobiologia last fall. So we made this discovery at home that my son was seeing with words. And that was how he was able to fly under the radar, because my son quite literally, although he has almost no vision whatsoever, he has memorized all the verbal characteristics of how we describe what things look like. And so, for example, before I had cataract surgery 2 years ago, I used to wear glasses. And so my characteristics used to be tall blonde glasses. And when my son thought those words to himself, he would get a momentary glimpse of what I look like. And he did that for absolutely everything all day long. And he,
Wow.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So now he's seen at the Perkins School of the Blind. He goes through again, more testing, and the head of the department, ocular department, diagnoses him. Amen. How many years? That must have been a couple of years. Sounds like it was a couple of years in the making.
It was 15 months from the time we first discovered Sebastian's CVI to the time when we finally got a diagnosis. It took 15 months.
15 months too long, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah. Well, and the saddest thing of all, I think, the fact is, once I knew what Sebastian had, it took me less than a minute in my kitchen to come up with simple, easy screenings for some of the different common symptoms of CVI. My son could have been screened as a 3-year-old if anyone had known how to do it. And this is what's so frustrating, because our optometric exams are just decades out of date. There's so much more to vision than just your acuity. Our optometric exams they look at your acuity. Well, our vision is so much more than that. There's so much more to it. And so the way the brain works, when light comes through the eyes, it passes through the eyes, and our eyes actually don't see anything at all. Our eyes are literally just light collectors. And the signals are then transferred through the optic nerve, and they go past a body called the lateral geniculate nuclei, and then they travel to the back of the brain. It takes about 1/10 of a second from the time that light travels through the eye to the back of the brain before we have any conscious perception of sight whatsoever. And so we really need to think about vision as a brain function rather than as an eye function. Yes, eyes are important, but the eyes actually don't see. The seeing happens in the brain. We have 2 different streams of visual processing through our brain. There's what's called the dorsal stream, which runs up through the back of the brain. And then there's the ventral stream that runs through the middle of the brain. And the dorsal stream is, when people have dorsal stream processing problems, they might have difficulty with finding a distant target or picking someone out of a crowd. Those are things that are associated with dorsal stream impairment. And of course, I'm giving a very general overview here. It's a lot more complex.
Right, exactly. So then I want to chat about your book for a moment.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
You're welcome. So you have the diagnosis now, and he's going through that treatment protocol.
Well, it's not a treatment. There's no cure for CVI.
Okay. I said the wrong terminology there. I do apologize.
Oh, it's okay. No,
but he's going through that the training. Am I understanding?
No, he went through a research study.
The research study. Okay.
Yes, Dr. Lotfi Marabet runs a research lab, and so they did another research study on Sebastian, and he donated his time. They actually, he laid in the fMRI for 6 hours while they took billions of pictures of his brain, and they actually gave him a little clicker so that when he was thinking, the research study has a really amazing visual search computer program that they're using that measures your eye movements. I believe it's at 90 times a second.
Mhm.
And they put that in the fMRI for him to look at, and they gave him a clicker. And so whenever he was thinking words, he would click the clicker. And then whenever he wasn't thinking words, he would unclick the clicker, so that
Okay.
they could tell when he was thinking words and when he wasn't. And what the fMRI showed was that his brain, the visual cortex of his brain, lights up when he thinks words, and it is not active at all when he's not. So my son is actually the only person in the world who can choose to see or not see with his eyes wide open. He actually has no conscious of perception of sight when he's not thinking descriptor words to himself.
Wow, I just got chills when you said that. That's wow.
Yeah. And we figured that out at home, right? And then trying to get doctors to listen to us, going, we have something you need to know about, that this is something, I knew, I'm like, this is, yeah.
And that obviously prompted you to do this book, Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. Can you tell about us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So once I figured out that Sebastian had CVI, and we went for almost 6 months going from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor, using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms. And I never once heard the term cerebral or cortical visual impairment from any of them. So it was 6 months into our journey before I finally learned what the name of my son's condition was. And remember, this is the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world. So that was awesome. Not. And so here I am finally learning what this is. And then I discovered that not only is it not rare, which I've been repeatedly and mistakenly told, oh, that's so rare, your son could never be face blind. It's so rare. That's so rare. Well, it's not rare at all. It happens all the time. So that's when I realized, if my blind son can be walking around looking completely typically sighted, then anyone can be. It can't just be us. Right. And we need to have better optometric exams that are evaluating more symptoms beyond just acuity and color blindness. We need more than that. And so once I realized that, I'm like, I cannot leave the rest of these tens of thousands of other people out there in the world and not fight for them, because what I told you, I mean, our story is not unique in any way. This happens all the time, every day. And what we find out, well, the average teacher of the visually impaired, more than half of their caseload, their kids have CVI. And the vast majority of teachers of the visually impaired receive little to no training whatsoever in CVI in their university training programs. The only teacher training program for teachers of the visually impaired that I am aware of right now that even requires coursework in CVI is at UMass in Boston. I think there might be one other, but that's the only one I know for sure. And so we have this enormous public health crisis, and it's not just us. There's just thousands of people, and tens of thousands of people. And I know that many, many kids who have CVI, one of the symptoms that you often see is lack of eye contact. We actually have photos of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from birth. We have photos of my blind son using visual guidance of reach from a developmentally appropriate age. He had all normal developmental milestones. However, the vast majority of kids who have CVI are severely developmentally delayed. And so what we are seeing is even children who manage to get a diagnosis for CVI even early on, even they are struggling to get appropriate services, educational services. Even with a diagnosis, are struggling to get orientation and mobility training services. It's just a mess.
Wow. So you sit down to write this book. How long did it take you, #1, to write the book?
I love that question. Okay, so first of all, I have 36 single-space type pages of documentation of what we went through medically. Mm-hmm. I documented everything. Once I realized that the doctors were not going to be, this wasn't going to be an easy journey, I just started writing everything down. And so that became the second half of my book. And it took me 2 months to write the draft of my book. 2 months, because I already had the outline of the entire second half. Took me 2 months. And then I spent a good year after that editing and editing and editing and editing. And if you compared the original draft to what it is now, you'd be like, this isn't even the same book. Yeah.
Well,
But
that's amazing that out of really a tragic situation with your child to everything that all of you went through to writing this book, where can viewers and listeners find your book?
well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. The book is called Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. And my name is Stephanie Duesing, Duesing. My book's available on Amazon. That's where most people pick it up. And if you just Google Eyeless Mind, it'll pop right up. And
Okay.
I have beautiful endorsements from the best vision and brain specialists in the world. And everyone who reads the book tells me that it's a really quick read and that it's a lot more, I don't know, they just tell me they can't put it down. I think because it's true, right? Everything in it is true. So,
And that's a wonderful testament to a mother's love, but to take a situation like that and knowing that your contribution or to the world or to help others was to share what you and your family went through. And I can't thank you enough for sharing part of your story here. I do have another question though. How is your son doing today?
well, thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, and I so appreciate all your time and letting me share this story. I appreciate your question about Sebastian too. He's doing really well. He, although he has almost no visual memory whatsoever and is almost completely blind, Sebastian got a 5 on the AP Art History exam. And he received the Presidential Award and Scholarship to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago when he was a senior in high school. And he went off to there to study art history as a freshman. And while he was there, he connected with a science professor that he was taking a science course with. And that connection has just inspired a whole different life passion for him. And so he's actually changed course and he's working towards a STEM career now. And so, yeah, he's passionate about what he's doing and he's enjoying it and loving it and very successful. But yeah, we managed to get him orientation and mobility training through Leader Dogs for the Blind after he got a diagnosis. And they flew him out free of charge for a week-long intensive course in that. And Sebastian is now safe out in the world and he lives independently and he's happy and he travels the world by himself. And that's all we needed.
Oh, that is wonderful. And, please, give Sebastian a message for allowing him to come into the conversation without physically being here. I hope that someday I do get to meet your son. He sounds like a wonderful young man. And obviously through the love of his mom and dad, wow, this story is amazing. Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for, spending a little time with us today to share your story that I know has inspired me, that I know without a doubt, obviously from all your reviews, has inspired others.
Well,
To have
you.
those, you're welcome to have those families, have something in their hands where they can relate to and are probably better able to communicate, to different ocular type of doctors and, with everything that Sebastian went through. So I'm blown away.
Thank you.
You're
I am
very welcome.
so very grateful for your time today. And I hope that this message reaches a lot of families, because if my son can be blind and no one knows, really anybody could be. And if the only symptom we ever had that there might be something wrong with Sebastian was what appeared to be mild anxiety. He had what appeared to be mild separation anxiety in early childhood. And that's all we had to go on. And so, yeah, it can be very deceptive and it can be completely invisible disability. So I highly recommend, if you have any concerns about your child for any reason, about eye contact, difficulty, like with clumsiness, all those things, I would go straight to the Perkins School for the Blind website, Perkins, Perkins, Perkins School for the Blind. They have some great information there. And if you want more in-depth and very accurate, medically accurate, but accessible information, the best source of factual information that's free for anyone is www.cviscotland.org.
Scotland.org. Yes, I will make sure that gets in the show notes. Thank you. Thank you. I am inspired by your story. You know, folks, everyone has a story. And although Stephanie's story with her son Sebastian may be common for many people out there, whatever you're going through, whether it's CVI or if it's something else, like take note of what is happening, the conversations you have with all these different professionals, such as Stephanie did, which obviously helped her to develop and write that book in a way that could benefit anybody. And
I don't want to interrupt you, but I would say most importantly, those 36 pages of notes are what gave me credibility when I finally did find the right medical professionals who did know what was going on. And if you are having a medical issue, document everything. Document.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that. I want to thank everybody for being here today. And obviously to my guest, Stephanie Duesing, sharing her son's story and the process of CVI, the author of Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. Know that you have a story out there. And if you feel that you need to share that, do it in such a way that inspires us. My name is Janice, and I am the host of Stories That Inspire Us today with Stephanie Duesing. Let us know what you thought of today's podcast. You can always leave me a voice message on the website. And until the next time, be inspired, take action. Your story matters. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.